In today's video, we dive into 5 cases of people eaten alive inside their cars, from feral dogs shattering windows on Australia to a pack of starving wolves in Russia. But first we begin in India, where 2 young tourists' dream wildlife photography trip turns into an absolute nightmare. It was July 14th, 2017, inside Ranthambore National Park in Rajasthan, India. The heat pressed against the Jeep's metal frame. The forest was too quiet for that hour, and even the driver noticed the sambar deer had vanished from the usual spots. Somewhere out there, something large was moving, and the tourists didn't yet realize how close they were to it. Dylan Cooper, 28, and Maya Barnes, 26, were from Manchester. They had arrived in India 2 weeks earlier after saving for nearly a year. Dylan worked as a warehouse clerk. Maya ran the counter at a cafe. Their trip was meant to be a short break from routine before Dylan returned to night shifts. Both shared a mild obsession with wildlife photography, inspired by the BBC documentaries they watched on weekends. They had booked a budget wildlife tour through a small local agency, drawn by the promise of seeing Bengal tigers up close. Dylan had borrowed a high-zoom lens and was determined to get a perfect shot. The Bengal tiger is India's largest predator, with males reaching over 500 pounds and females not far behind. Known for their territorial nature, tigresses with cubs are notoriously defensive, reacting to any perceived threat with immediate aggression. They had joined 5 others for an afternoon safari, seated in an open-top gypsy jeep. Their driver, Rafiq, had been leading tours for over 10 years, and their park guide, Ashok, carried the quiet patience of someone used to warnings being ignored. Rafiq mentioned that Ranthambore's tigers had grown accustomed to vehicles, but could become aggressive if startled, or if tourists broke the rules. Maya nodded along, but looked mostly at Dylan's camera, smiling as he adjusted settings and talked about framing a tiger at eye level. They wanted something their friends wouldn't believe they'd taken themselves. The Jeep drove into Zone 3, an area of thick sal forest. The last stop of the day was near Rajbagh Lake, where deer grazed quietly on the far shore. That afternoon, the group spotted movement by a waterhole, a tigress, later designated RT-29 by park authorities, lying half in the shade, her nearly grown cub resting nearby. The animals were less than 90 feet away. Cameras lifted instantly. The guide whispered for everyone to stay quiet, to photograph from inside the Jeep. Ashok warned them sharply that stepping down was forbidden, but Dylan had already swung one leg over. Maya followed, clutching his arm. They stood only a few feet from the open door, close enough to smell the damp soil and hear distant insects. The cameras from the other tourists caught everything. The cub lifted its head first. Its ears twitched forward, then flattened. The tigress's tail began to flick, slow and deliberate. She rose with a low rumble, muscles coiling beneath striped skin as she walked forward. Rafiq hissed for them to get back in. Dylan raised his camera again, and that movement, small, sudden, confident, was enough. The tigress charged. The distance vanished in seconds. The impact hit Dylan. Witnesses said it looked like he had been struck by a falling beam. One moment standing, the next crushed beneath. The tigress clamped her jaws around his neck. Maya screamed and stumbled backward towards the Jeep, but the cub lunged after her, catching her by the thigh. She fell face first, kicking wildly as the cub tore at her leg. Rafiq slammed his fist on the hood, revving the engine hard. The noise made the tigress pause just long enough for the cub to release Maya. She tried crawling, dragging her injured leg through the dirt. Dylan's body jerked once beneath the tigress's weight, then went still. When the tigress turned toward the Jeep, Rafiq threw the vehicle in reverse. The group shouted for Maya to move, but she didn't respond. The cub returned to her, swiping with its paw, claws opening her back from shoulder to waist. The attack lasted less than 2 minutes. When the tigress finally retreated, dragging Dylan by the neck into the tall grass, the cub followed. The forest fell silent, except for the Jeep's engine and the faint rustle where the tigers had vanished. Maya lay motionless. The other tourists sat frozen, none daring to step down. Ashok radioed a nearby patrol unit. Patrol rangers reached the site nearly an hour later, delayed by poor radio contact and rough terrain. By then, the light had faded entirely, and the forest was quiet again. They found Maya near the road, lifeless, her leg mangled and her back slashed deep. A search team followed the drag marks through the brush and located Dylan's remains 70 feet from the clearing. Both had been dragged, and signs of initial feeding behavior were present on the remains. Rangers covered the bodies with canvas sheets and lifted them into the vehicle. The park was closed for the next 3 days while authorities reviewed safety procedures. News of the incident briefly reached national outlets in India, drawing public criticism over tourist enforcement and guide oversight. The tigress and her cub were tracked and later relocated to a restricted reserve outside Jaipur. An internal inquiry by the Forest Department concluded that the attack stemmed from rule violations, though no charges were filed. Within a week, coverage faded, overshadowed by a series of animal attacks in nearby districts. Yet even as 2 tourists' lives ended in tall grass stained with blood, in Australia, a stranded truck driver would watch feral dogs, unaware that his cab window was about to become the only barrier between them. It was November 8, 2014, on the Nullarbor Plain in South Australia. The highway was empty for nearly 100 miles in every direction, a place where engines failed more often than help arrived. Feral dogs had been sighted along the route for weeks, but few drivers stopped long enough to notice. Gareth Mills, 44, had been driving trucks for over 2 decades. He worked long, repetitive routes between Perth and Adelaide. He liked the solitude, the straight roads, and the predictable rhythm of the work. That weekend, he was on the return leg of a solo haul, hauling spare parts to Kalgoorlie before cutting south across the plain. He had left late, hoping to make up time by driving through the night. The Nullarbor was familiar ground for him. He'd slept in the cab plenty of times, with only wind and insects for company. His truck was his world. Tools in the glove compartment, food in a small cooler, a 2-way radio he kept on Channel 40 for roadside assistance. He'd broken down before, but not out here, a stretch this far from the next roadhouse. That afternoon, about 90 miles west of Mundrabila, the engine sputtered and died. He coasted to the shoulder, checked the gauges, then the battery. The problem looked electrical. He made one radio call to a dispatcher in Norseman, who said a tow unit couldn't reach him until morning. Gareth shut off the ignition, leaving the parking lights on. He sat back in the cab, unwrapped a sandwich from the cooler, and ate slowly. The feral dogs that roamed the Nullarbor were descendants of domestic pets and dingoes, mixed over generations into a hardy, semi-wild strain. They traveled in packs of 6 to 12, scavenging roadkill or raiding bins from rest stops. On occasion, they had been known to attack livestock or people when food was scarce. They could smell meat or decay from over a mile away. Recorded attacks on people were nearly unheard of in the region, and was later described what followed as a rare convergence of conditions: an engine failure, long isolation, and a partially breached cab that allowed scavengers to act with aggression uncharacteristic of their species. Sometime around midnight, Gareth noticed movement near the beam of his headlights. Shadows flitted in and out of view, low to the ground. He leaned forward, thinking at first it was kangaroos crossing. Then he heard it, short, guttural barking, not distant, but close. Shapes began circling the truck just outside the cone of light. He counted at least 4. They moved with a kind of order, spreading out, tails stiff, eyes glinting when they passed through the light. He then locked the doors. The barking grew louder, then turned into snarling. Something thudded against the side of the cab. He switched on the dome light and grabbed a wrench from the floor. Through the windshield, he could see their outlines now. Dogs, lean and dirty, with the thick shoulders and narrow heads of dingoes. They paced around the front tires, noses lifted. One jumped at the door, claws scraping the metal. The smell of sweat and old food filled the cab. Gareth shouted, slapped the horn, but it only set them off more. A motorist driving eastbound later recalled seeing the truck's dome light flickering briefly before going dark. That was the last time anyone saw movement inside. When the tow unit arrived just after sunrise, the scene looked ordinary. Then they noticed the side mirror dangling, the glass of the driver's window shattered inward. Investigators determined the driver's side window had been partially lowered for ventilation, leaving it vulnerable when the dogs leapt against it. Forensic investigators reconstructed the events from the evidence inside. The dogs had likely gathered on the driver's side, jumping repeatedly at the window. Over time, the tempered glass cracked under pressure from claws and impacts. When it gave way, Gareth had been sitting in the driver's seat, possibly trying to start the truck again. Blood patterns showed that he was attacked first on the arm and shoulder, defensive wounds suggesting he had swung the wrench. One dog tore into his forearm, severing tendons, while another clamped onto his neck. There was evidence of movement across the cab, smears of blood on the steering wheel, the passenger seat, and the side panel. He had fought fought for several minutes before an artery was torn. When rescuers found him, his body was slumped sideways against the door. The interior was smeared with blood and paw prints. Several pieces of clothing were missing, likely shredded in the struggle. Claw marks scored the dashboard. There were no dogs in sight by morning, only tracks leading into the scrub behind the truck. Wildlife officers trapped 5 feral dogs within a mile of the site that afternoon. Analysis confirmed their stomach contents contained human tissue. All were euthanized on location. The trucking company placed a small notice 2 weeks later, warning drivers to stay inside and keep radios active at all times. No one from Gareth's family spoke publicly. His ashes were scattered quietly outside Perth, near the depot where his last route began. The Australian outback bore witness to blood-soaked cab interiors where feral dogs had torn through. And in Kenya, a couple would park their Jeep within striking distance of a lion pride, triggering a 400-pound leap. It was March 19, 2016, in the Masai Mara National Reserve, Kenya. Late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the plains. It was the kind of golden light photographers dream of, the hour when everything looked alive and calm, just before the predators began to move. Anton and Lena Fisher, both 34, had arrived from Hamburg 3 days earlier. Anton was a civil engineer who saved every year for long photography trips. Birds in Namibia, elephants in Botswana, now lions in Kenya. Lena worked for a shipping firm and often said she didn't care for the heat, but she came along anyway, handling logistics and keeping notes. They planned the trip through a small tour company, splitting time between guided drives and one self-drive day, a privilege still allowed in certain sectors. Anton wanted that day to photograph without crowds. Their plan was simple: take the Jeep, cover a short loop around Topi Plains, and return by dusk. They packed food, a cooler of drinks, and 2 camera bodies with long lenses. The roof hatch of their rented Toyota Land Cruiser was fixed open for shooting. Rangers had mentioned that lions were active near the area that week, with one pride resting close to a waterhole. Anton brushed off the warning. He wanted close-up shots, and he believed that staying in the vehicle was safe enough. The Jeep's sides were closed, the hatch wide enough to stand through for photography. It felt controlled. A line of acacia trees marked the edge of a dry stream bed where a pride of lions, 6 females and 3 subadults, lay in scattered shade. They were lean from the end of the dry season, their ribs faintly visible under tawny coats. Lions in the Mara were used to vehicles, but not all tolerated intrusion. Adult females could weigh over 280 pounds, strong enough to drag a zebra by the neck. They could leap 10 feet in a single bound. Earlier that week, rangers had posted advisories warning visitors to remain inside closed vehicles and to avoid parking near resting lions. Guides said the Topi Plains pride had become agitated lately, likely due to nearby hyenas or territorial shifts. Other tourists that afternoon noticed the couple's white Jeep pull close to the tree line, closer than recommended. Their guide, a veteran driver named Samuel Otieno, later said he saw Anton standing through the roof hatch, aiming his telephoto lens directly at the lions. Anton had leaned halfway out of the hatch, his upper body exposed above the roofline. For nearly a minute, the pride stayed still. Then one lioness lifted her head. Witnesses described her rising smoothly, tail flicking once, gaze fixed on the vehicle. She moved forward, slow but deliberate. Anton shifted position, possibly for a better shot. The lioness began to trot, closing the distance. Lena called out to her husband, motioning for him to sit. The animal broke into a short run, her stride low and fast. She hit the front of the Jeep with her forelegs, claws catching the edge of the hood. In one motion she was up, growling, her paws slamming the metal. Anton ducked halfway into the hatch. Witnesses from a nearby tour vehicle shouted to start the engine. The lioness lunged forward, one paw striking through the open roof, claws tearing down Anton's face and shoulder. Lena screamed and tried to pull him back, but the lioness forced her head through the opening, jaws closing on Anton's neck. Lena tried to push the lion back, beating at its muzzle with both hands. Another lion, a younger male, moved to the passenger side, pawing at the window. Claws screeched against glass. The first lioness yanked at Anton's upper body. When the guide vehicle revved its engine and advanced toward them, the lioness turned, dragging Anton halfway out of the hatch. Lena clung to his arm until the weight pulled her forward. She fell against the seat, bleeding from deep gashes in her forearms. Witnesses said the lions backed off only when the second vehicle blared its horn and moved closer. The lioness dropped Anton's body beside the Jeep, standing over him, her muzzle dark with blood. Lena stumbled out through the side door, screaming and collapsing on the dirt. The younger lion circled once before before retreating to the shade. Rangers stationed nearby arrived within 15 minutes. By then, Anton was already dead from massive trauma to the neck and chest. Lena was still breathing but unconscious, her right arm torn nearly to the bone. She died in the medical camp before evacuation. Authorities sealed off the area by nightfall. Autopsy reports listed Anton's cause of death as cervical dislocation and exsanguination. Lena's injuries were consistent with defensive wounds. The self-drive permit system for that section of the Mara was suspended immediately. Rangers emphasized that the lions showed normal territorial behavior, provoked by proximity and sound. The Fisher family declined interviews, and their tour company removed all images from social media. Their remains were flown to Nairobi, then repatriated to Germany within a week. For months afterward, guides used the incident as a warning for tourists. The white Jeep was eventually towed and stripped for inspection, but for a while, locals said it sat behind the ranger compound. However, even as the Kenyan savannah echoed with the screams of German tourists, in Zimbabwe, a poacher would load fresh bushmeat into his truck, unaware that an enraged bull elephant had been tracking the sound of his rifle. It was December 22, 2015, in Hwange National Park, western Zimbabwe. The land looked calm, but carried the residue of tension. Poachers had been active that week, and the animals had grown uneasy. Tobias Chuma was 46, once a respected game scout under the National Parks Authority. He'd spent years guiding anti-poaching patrols and knew the park's layout as well as anyone alive. But when his contract ended in 2013 and he failed to find steady work, he began hunting small antelope to sell for meat. It wasn't a matter of greed, it was survival. He lived with his sister's family, supporting 5 children. The risks were familiar: patrols, informants, wild animals, but so were the methods. He still used his scout's ID, hoping that if caught, it might buy him a warning instead of jail time. He drove alone that night, wearing a faded khaki shirt and gum boots, following a dirt track he had walked hundreds of times during his career. His plan was to shoot an impala before midnight and return home before dawn. The December heat lingered even after dark, the smell of dust and diesel mixing with the sour odor of blood from a previous kill. The moonlight revealed wide swaths of grass and scattered acacia stands. Hwange's southern boundary was dry, its pans reduced to cracked clay. Animals had congregated along deeper waterholes, among them elephant bulls that had grown increasingly aggressive that month. Rangers had noted one in particular, a large male with a torn right ear, that had charged vehicles without provocation. Elephants, especially bulls in musth, can reach speeds of 25 miles per hour and carry up to 6 tons of mass. Tobias had seen elephant herds his whole life and assumed this one would keep its distance. When he spotted an impala grazing near a termite mound, he parked, stepped out, and fired a single shot. The animal dropped immediately. He dragged the carcass into the truck bed, tied it with rope, and started the engine. He didn't notice the shadowed shape 50 yards away, a lone bull shifting restlessly among the trees. Earlier that day, 2 villagers had warned Tobias that elephants near Ngamo had been behaving erratically, damaging fences and charging at distant noises. He'd laughed it off, saying they always turned aggressive when poachers disturbed their calves. As he reversed the truck to turn, his headlights flashed briefly across the animal's flank. The bull froze, ears spread wide. Tobias honked once, intending to drive it off. That was the mistake. Moments later, the elephant charged. The first impact came from the side, a dull, concussive blow that snapped the front axle and tipped the truck off balance. Tobias tried to reverse again, tires spinning in dust, but the bull struck once more, its tusk gouging through the driver's door. The vehicle tipped, rolled, and landed roof first. Tobias's body slammed against the window, breaking it outward. He tried to crawl halfway out, disoriented, when the elephant trampled the cab, pressing down with several tons of weight. The metal collapsed around him. One tusk punched through the roof and ripped backward. Tobias's torso was caught under the crushed frame. Massive thoracic compression caused fatal internal injuries. Blood spread across the door panel. The animal stepped again, shattering the windshield, flattening the hood, and twisting the steering column into the floor. When the bull finally backed off, it lingered beside the wreck, shaking its head and stamping. The impala carcass had fallen from the bed, and the elephant kicked it aside before retreating into the trees. According to investigations, around midnight, hyenas began to arrive, likely drawn by the scent of blood and torn metal. Bite marks on the remains later showed that they fed mostly on exposed tissue of the neck, forearms, and abdomen. At dawn, 2 rangers patrolling found the scene. The pickup was inverted, its chassis bent, and the roof flattened nearly to seat level. rifle. Tobias's body lay half out of the driver's window, face turned toward the dirt. His rifle rested under the truck, bent in half. One ranger recognized him immediately. They covered the body with a tarp and waited for transport, keeping their rifles ready. The autopsy at Huanga District Hospital confirmed massive chest compression, skull fractures, and broken vertebrae consistent with a large animal trampling. Forensic photographs showed partial post-mortem feeding by hyenas. The elephant was never found. Officials never issued a formal statement. His burial took place that Friday, the coffin plain and unmarked except for his name scratched on one corner. His sister wept quietly through the service, saying only that Tobias had taught them never to fear the bush. Later, she told a ranger that her brother had planned to stop hunting after the holidays, to start work at a safari lodge if a position opened. She still waited for that call. As the dust settled over the trampled remains in Zimbabwe, in Russia, a maintenance worker would discover that when winter's grip tightens and hunger drives predators to desperation. It was June 12, 2016, near Glacier National Park, Montana. The summer season had just begun, and the park's west entrance was already crowded with rental SUVs and roadside pull-offs full of visitors taking photos of elk. Rangers had posted warnings for weeks. Black bears were active along McDonald Creek, drawn by the early salmon runs and tourist litter that came with them. Emily Warren, 24, was a college student from Spokane visiting the park with two friends. They had driven up for a weekend trip in a borrowed sedan, hoping to see wildlife before the crowds thickened. Emily was the outgoing one of the group, known for taking risks, getting close to animals for photos, and posting the results online with sarcastic captions. Her friends, Tessa and Brooke, said later she always wanted the kind of pictures people gasped at. They'd spent the day hiking short trails and stopping at overlooks. Around 6:30 p.m., as they headed back toward West Glacier, traffic slowed near a turnout by the creek. A group of cars had pulled over. Someone was pointing toward the tree line. A black bear, roughly 200 pounds, was moving along the embankment, occasionally stopping to dig through brush. The bear looked calm, used to vehicles. Tourists leaned out of windows, snapping photos. Emily told her friends to pull over. The air was heavy with the smell of wet pine and exhaust. The bear moved closer, crossing a narrow ditch and sniffing near the edge of the road. Other drivers began to move on. Emily rolled down her window, filming on her phone. The bear lifted its head, watching the cars pass. Her video caught her laughing softly, saying that he's so chill. When the animal turned away, she opened her door halfway and stepped out with her phone raised. Tessa told her to get back in, but Emily ignored her. The bear paused, staring over its shoulder. She made a soft clicking sound, calling it Buddy as she moved closer. That was when it huffed, an audible warning most people would have recognized as a sign to back off. Emily hesitated, smiled at the camera, then reached toward her pocket, likely for a snack wrapper she'd joked about using to get him to look. The bear's ears went flat. It charged. The sprint from the ditch to the car took less than 3 seconds. Emily turned to run, tripping over the gravel lip near the open door. The bear hit her from behind, claws tearing through the back of her jacket. She screamed once, trying to pull herself into the driver's seat. The bear came in after her, its front paws landing on the seat as it bit into her shoulder. Brooke tried slamming the door from the other side, but the bear's body blocked it. It swung its head violently, dragging Emily halfway out of the vehicle. Witnesses in the next car saw the scene unfold from 20 feet away. One man leaned on his horn continuously, while another threw a bottle at the animal. The bear released for a moment, pulling back just enough for Emily to slump into the footwell. Blood covered the steering wheel and door panel. The bear swiped again, catching her leg and tearing through denim and skin to the muscle. Brooke climbed into the back seat screaming, while Tessa fumbled with the ignition, hitting the gas before the door was closed. The car lurched forward, throwing the bear off balance as it let go. It followed for a few yards before veering back toward the tree line. They made it less than a mile before stopping at a ranger checkpoint. Emily was still conscious, bleeding heavily from deep bites to her shoulder and thigh. She had lost significant blood before paramedics arrived. Rangers on patrol reached the checkpoint within 15 minutes, applying pressure dressings until the ambulance arrived. Despite emergency treatment at Kalispell Regional, she went into cardiac arrest within the hour. Park rangers secured the area and followed blood tracks back toward the creek. The bear, later identified as a young adult male, was located that night scavenging near a picnic site. It showed no signs of continued aggression toward vehicles, but had traces of human tissue in its stomach contents. After review by wildlife officials, the animal was euthanized on site in accordance with park protocol. The investigation found that Emily had violated multiple safety regulations regulations, including exiting her vehicle within 50 yards of a bear and possessing food items outside designated areas. Rangers later confirmed that the video recovered from her phone matched the timeline reconstructed from witness statements, showing the bear's first warning huff, her hesitation, and the initial lunge. In the weeks that followed, Tessa and Brooke left school early that summer, unable to finish the semester. Tessa's car, the same one they'd used on the trip, sat untouched in her driveway for months. At the park's request, the two returned to Glacier in late August for a closed debrief with rangers. Their friendship didn't survive the following year. Brooke moved south for nursing school. Tessa transferred to a community college closer to home.